Welcome to Angry Robot Live Returns. I'm your host, Mike Underwood, and I'm joined today by three of our wonderful, maniacal, and marvelous authors. Today we're going to be talking about contemporary fantasy, urban and otherwise. So I'm going to highlight our guests and give you a brief introduction, and then we will start talking. Please remember that you can ask questions through the Q&A app in this Hangout if it works. Please Google. Or via Twitter using hashtag #ARLive. So we have today Alyc Helms, author of The Dragons of Heaven, which is a debut coming from Angry Robot in June. We have Ferrett Steinmetz, author of Flux, which was just released in March. And we have joining us from the shadows, because video is being a problem, Tim Waggoner, who's the author of the Necropolis series and the Shadow Watch series. So thank you all for joining us.
Yay!
Thank you for having us.
All right. Yes, that's a little bit silly because I'm the one who set all of this up. It's my master plan, so blame me if anything goes wrong. So I wanted to talk about contemporary fantasy, and I'll do a tiny bit of definitional work first so that we don't have to spend 20 minutes on definitional arguments, because we've all been to that panel. So for contemporary fantasy, I'm going to draw a really wide umbrella, so that this is any fantasy that happens in our world, a world that's like our world, plus or minus, and more or less in the modern era. So this includes what we think of as urban fantasy, and then a lot of other things that get different labels. So we go wide, that way we have lots of things to play with. So what I wanted to do to start the conversation is to ask each of our authors why you chose to set your Angry Robot work, and maybe among other work, in a contemporary fantasy setting, and kind of what you think that brings to the table. So let's start with Alyc.
Oh, God.
Answer now.
I think you should send one of the other guys first. I feel like the canary. I came about it pretty organically. I had a couple things that I was working on, and this particular story, The Dragons of Heaven, is started out from a pulp adventure tabletop game that I was playing in, and I had started writing it as like a little character backstory fic, and along around the time I hit 40,000 words, and I was also 40,000 words on this really big, epic, secondary world Italianate fantasy thing. And I was like, the urban fantasy is going to be a lot easier to do as a first novel. And so a lot of it just came out of, that was the particular story that I had energy on and movement on. And I think that, you know, what it offers is it's not that there isn't world building, because there definitely is world building, but you can kind of take a lot for granted. You take a lot of shared knowledge for granted. You don't have to kind of spoon feed your readers everything that's going on, and you don't have to do this like huge amounts of set dressing. You can kind of really get into the characters. You can get into the plot. You can really kind of go with it. So that was, for me, it was a first novel thing of, I wanted to not have to worry about the stuff that I wasn't yet ready to really tackle, and really concentrate on the things that I was interested in, which were character, plot, pacing, and really telling a ripping story that also maybe had some commentary about things that I care about that are contemporary issues. So, yeah.
Cool. All right, why don't we jump over to Tim? Tim, are you still with us in the shadows?
Oh no.
I hope that he hasn't been swallowed by one of the incubi from his books. Okay. I'm going to try and troubleshoot with Tim, and let's hop over to Ferrett in the meantime.
Okay. I'm sort of with you, Alyc. You know, basically, one of the things that I actually love to do, because I am a gigantic frickin' nerd, is I love to world build, and I love to world build really extravagant worlds, and that's actually a huge drawback in what I was doing. And like, to give an example, I had some novels that I was trying to sell beforehand that I just couldn't make work because, one took place and it was 500 years in the future, and it was like basically 400 years after the singularity, and everybody had their brains uploaded into, these storage units except for this handful of living people who were still sort of scrabbling now, and suddenly the living were uncool and they were second-class citizens. And the first 3 chapters, just to root you in this world, took so much energy that people couldn't follow the characters. And they kept going, I don't know what's going on. And they would pay more attention to the backdrop than the kid in the front who I was trying to get you to actually, if not fall in love with, find interesting enough to then follow through the next 400 pages that were going in. And so when I started to write Flux, I decided to do the old urban fantasy BS trick, which is, basically, it's exactly like our world, with a couple of minor differences, but it's like our world, which I always define to be kind of BS from a world-building standpoint, and I see that in a lot of novels, and particularly in mine, because what will happen is it'll be like, yes, well, there's this huge vampiric conspiracy that's shaken world politics and gone back for generations, and yet you still have Dunkin' Donuts and Halo coming out in 2002. In Flex, it's ridiculous, and I'm not trying to be that guy on the panel, but I can point out, some of the flaws in my own book, certainly, is that, basically it explicitly says that there are pyromancers going back to caveman days who are getting so obsessed with fire that they were setting entire woods on fire, and yet somehow all of our politics have stayed all the same right up until the moment the reader comes on board. And I got dinged a couple of times by beta readers who were saying, well, you have to consider the world building. I'm like, no, that's a conscious sacrifice I made so readers would not have to take on the onus of coming into an entirely new world. I could tell the story and have them concentrate on the characters, not the background. So.
All right, and Tim is back. Welcome back, Tim.
I hope I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yay! We have Tim.
So you're up for kind of why make a choice to do a contemporary setting for your Angry Robot series.
Right. The contemporary setting allows for contemporary attitudes. One of the things about medieval fantasy that always struck me as strange is that the people in medieval fantasy stories often are really modern people that, in terms of their attitudes and the way they relate to one another. And it can strike kind of a false note. The other thing about it is that it's a lot more interesting if magic impinges on the real world because there's a greater sense of wonder, I think. People characters who live in a fantasy world, to them that's like reality, even if it's kind of a rare reality, like for us to go to Africa and see giraffes and rhinos and such. But we know they're real and we know they are normal things in the world. But for people in the real world to suddenly see something, very, very strange, it can really create, some of the best things that you can get from horror, and also to kind of recreate that sense of wonder that you hope you can get from a fantasy story.
Cool. So I wanted to kind of take something a little bit from what Ferrett had said and pose it to everybody. And that is kind of how do you decide the balance of to what degree the fantastical element of your world impinges on the history of the world? How do you find that balance between acknowledging what's there and making sure that the world is still familiar, or integrating the fantastic into the real world? So we've gotten a little bit of kind of Ferrett's perspective on this one, is making a conscious choice. Kind of what were your processes, either Tim or Alyc, with that kind of those decisions?
Okay. Well, in my particular case, I mean, both the Necropolis series and the Shadow Watch series, they do take place in worlds that are kind of separate from Earth. In Necropolis, all of Earth's dark folk, witches, vampires, and werewolves, about 400 years ago, they immigrated from Earth to another dimension. And so the bulk of all the action takes place in that city, that other dimensional city. In the Shadow Watch, it's half and half. It's because I set up Shadow Watch to be living nightmares, I thought it would be a good idea to do kind of like a day-night split. And so, in terms of the book, I'll have about half of it take place in the real world, and then half of it take place in the dream world, because that's pretty much how, we as humans live our lives. So I'll let the concepts kind of dictate that.
Cool.
And I guess for me, I'm I'm kind of drawing from, but also commenting on literary and a comic book history. I'm talking about Pulp Adventure and The Shadow and Doc Savage and Dashiell Hammett, and I'm talking about Silver and Golden Age comics and everything like that. And so one of the things I get to do is, because I have a folklore background, I'm very aware of the way that the stories that people told, the stories that they told about that thing that happened on the road a couple years ago, or that well that is down in the glen, or things like that, were very real parts of their world, even though we could look back and say, if you don't believe in this kind of stuff, well, there were no ghosts there, there was no magic there, there were no fairies dancing there, whatever. But the way that stories kind of shape our understanding of history of stories, but the way that stories shape our understanding of history, and so I kind of used that, and I used the ways, the functions that pulp and the functions that comics and the functions that all these stories that we told in the past served for the people then, and the different meanings we take from them now, the kind of critiques we have towards them. And I used that to, I guess, flavor my history. So in Dragons of Heaven, when they're talking about contemporary, what are the issues around contemporary superheroes, they're talking about we're corporate-sponsored heroes, and the way that we've lost this kind of like golden age. But was the golden age really all that golden when it was supporting some very problematic kind of McCarthyism or things like that? And so I could kind of use the literary history and the history of critique on the literary side and just bring that into the real world, and kind of balance those two things out of the impact on our imagination versus the impact on the real world. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Ferrett, in Flux, I noticed that there's quite a lot of kind of a magical history, because the magic kind of Mancers are public, and then there's some big events in kind of international magic history. How did you decide where in the kind of foreground versus background to put that magical history?
Well, it was really interesting for me, because one of the things that I didn't realize that I was doing at the time, but I wanted to make it a place where magic was very, very rare. But magic's kind of like terrorism, and there is an explicit magic to terrorism analog, because there's only about 1 in 50,000 people who can obsess enough, because in Flex, magic comes from obsessing over something over and over again until your desire literally punches a hole through physics. And that's really rarely common. And so what you get is this sort of media frenzy around it, where everybody wants to know about it, but hardly anybody has any direct experience with it to talk about it. So it enabled me to have a world where there's a tremendous interest in this thing, and yet, because magic has gone horribly wrong in the past, and it's gone so horribly wrong that, in fact, in the book it's well known that basically Europe, gone, thanks to some sort of magical accident that happened. That basically the U.S. government has clamped down, doesn't want magic users to have any kind of magic, and as a result, you have a lot of real interest but no real information, which is actually a really good place to put a protagonist, because he knows a little more than you, but not a whole lot more, and actually finding that out becomes the core of the novel, which will allow you to drag the reader along. Mm-hmm. And as a side note, I will mention that if you casually just wake up one day and go, I want magic to seem dangerous, so Europe's gone. Should this book get published? You're going to get some pissy emails from your European friends. They're like, what'd I do to you? I'm like, sorry, Brussels. Had nothing.
So that brings up an interesting question, and that's kind of casting. And what I would ask is, how do you decide, and this may not be specifically your process, how do you decide kind of who the person is to stand at the crux of history or at the crux of the story for each of your worlds and the kind of the plots that you're coming about? Do you tend to start with character first, or are you figuring out how to fit a character into a world? And that's open for anybody.
I'll take it if nobody minds. The interesting thing for me is how the character who I thought I wanted to have was not the character who I ultimately needed, which was really interesting, because in Flux, there's a lot of magic, and basically, it's no secret. It's basically inspired by Breaking Bad meets my Magic campaign, because it's all about brewing magical drugs and the underground drug world. And the interesting thing is, when I started writing it, and this is something you can do if you've been writing for long enough, I said, okay, I'm just basically going to put Walter White in there and hope I come up with something better than that by the time I get halfway through. And I did, and what I found out was that my lead character, because I wanted something interesting, was a bureaucromancer. He's obsessed with paperwork. Basically, he can work with the DMV. He can drop legal magical warrants on the desk, send SWAT teams crashing through your house. He can backdate apartments, so he can just move into apartments he's never even lived in before. And the interesting thing is, in the beginning, he was an ex-cop who was ambitious and really hated that, and I was sort of going through all of that, and it's like, oh, he seeks power. And then in the end, basically, I realized he's a super-powered Radar O'Reilly. Like, he really believes in the goodness of mankind. He really believes that corporations would screw you over if you did not have that form to slam on their desk and go, no, I owe this. And that actually provided me with a good character. But I didn't understand that till I got to a scene 50,000 words into the book. And then I had to go back and rewrite to make my lead character into the person he is today. So, I mean, basically the lesson from all of this is I'm absolutely terrible at knowing what my book needs until I'm 50,000 words in. So. Tim Morrell? Are you guys?
Do we still not have Tim?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, good. Gee, I don't, with Necropolis.
In the last few seconds. Okay, go.
Okay. Sorry, Mike, I couldn't hear you on that. You kind of faded in and out. So, in the Necropolis series.
That's fine. Please proceed.
Okay. In the Necropolis series, since I was trying to do not a parody, but kind of an homage to private detective stories, trying to write about the world-weary kind of former cop who's a detective, and then use that as a metaphor for a man who's dead and who's rotting away. And use that as kind of a metaphor too for like the world after World War I, where you get that kind of sort of existential, what is the meaning to life, and there is no meaning, and all that kind of thing. The world weariness of that kind of character was already kind of there. For Shadow Watch, I often alternate between books, a male protagonist or a female protagonist, or sometimes I'll have both, depending. So for this one, when I came up with the idea that one of the main characters was going to be a nightmare clown come to life, well, my daughter really hates clowns, so I just decided to go ahead and, make his partner, his human partner, the one who dreamed him up, make that character a woman. And then from there, once I started coming up with the fact that the people, I call them ideators, who can create, who dream up these, with no control of their own, it just happens, these nightmare characters, that they no longer sleep anymore. It made me think about, well, what do they do to keep going, and do they need any kind of rest? Do they need to meditate? And so I decided that she would be hooked on a stimulant that would kind of keep her going throughout the course of her day and all the adventures that they have, that she didn't want to take 5 hours a day to meditate like she was supposed to. There's work to be done. There's lots of danger out there to be dealt with. And so those two things kind of coalesced. And then plus having her, her character be somebody who kept her partner at arm's length because she's working literally with her worst nightmare. And then trying to find a way to, to use like a psychobabble term, she had to make friends with her worst fear, throughout the course of that book. So those kind of elements kind of all coalesced together to make her character.
And for you, Alyc?
So I guess for me, it's funny because I think this kind of gets to one of the characteristics that is very common, if not ubiquitous, in urban fantasy, if not contemporary fantasy, which is the kind of first-person narrator, and it being very heavily related to voice. And so for me, it definitely came from the character, the voice, springing out of that. And for me, a lot of the challenge came from developing Missy's voice. Another one of the kind of tropes that you get a lot is the strong female character, and let's not even talk about that terminology, with the chip on her shoulder and the guns and the badass and everything. And I certainly have enjoyed a lot of those characters, but I'm like, I'm a kind of a friendly, nice, happy-going, easy-go-lucky person, and I'm like, what? I like collaborative problem solving and all this other kind of stuff. And I was really interested to see, okay, so what if you have a character who is much more exploratory and doesn't have the huge chip on her shoulder and is idealistic and is kind of a little bit shiny-faced, and how does that kind of character interact with like challenges that aren't easily solved? And one of my favorite lines that her nemesis says to her is that idealism is a series of compromises waiting to happen. And a lot of Missy's journey ends up being about the kinds of compromises she's willing to make and the kinds of compromises she can't bring herself to make. And as we go through the book, we see her idealism getting a little bit tarnished, but also becoming more kind of complex and nuanced. And so it's not about like a new shiny-faced hero becoming like stronger. It's about a new shiny-faced hero becoming more complex, which for me was a more interesting story. So yeah.
So one of the other questions that I had, and this is something that I go back and forth on kind of as a reader and a writer both, is making the choice between using a real contemporary setting, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, or creating your own city and kind of peopling it as you need to. What do you all think are kind of the pluses and minuses of each of those approaches, kind of as it applies to what you can do or can't do with contemporary fantasy? This is up for anybody to start.
Well, I'll bring up one of my favorite kind of contemporary fantasy places that has been created is, and that I love going back to and over again, is Charles Dillon's Newford. Am I getting that right? Now I'm all questioning, wait, is that what the town is called? But I love going back, and I think what he's able to do there as he kind of builds this out of like short stories and then the Chili Coppercorn stuff and everything is this growing sense of the numinous, of magic behind every corner in strange places, in garbage heaps and in coffee shops, and kind of coloring the entire world as, if the entire world is in black and white, there's little bits of color, and it really gets the numinous. And I think that you can do that more easily in a made-up place. And so part of the Dragons of Heaven actually does take place in that, and it is the most magical part that takes place in a made-up place. But then I think that you can the excitement is that you can get to balance that with really drawing in on very granular details of the real world when you're dealing with real places. And my best experience of that, my most amazing experience of that, I was reading David Mitchell's Ghost Written, actually, and I was in London at a hotel at a business conference, and I'm reading this one sequence, and this character starts running through parts of London, and as I'm reading this, I'm like, hey, wait a second, I was there, I had tea there this afternoon, and hey, that's just down the street, and holy shit, the character just ran past my window. And I literally had a moment where I was like, I got up to go check out the window to see if he was like down the street. And then I was like, oh, what am I doing? But I think grounding in that granular reality where you can really recognize a place can create a different kind of a magical reading experience. And so I think both of them are pretty cool. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah. For me, it's interesting because writing a city is almost its own set of challenges, and I don't think I'm good at it, but the writers who can do it, I absolutely love. Actually, I can see over your left shoulder, there's the works of China Mieville, who's brilliant at... right shoulder, sorry. But yeah, who's absolutely brilliant at creating cities. New Chromosome feels completely alive to me. Robert Jackson Bennett does a phenomenal thing with City of Stairs. Max Gladstone does a brilliant job in his series. And the thing is, if you look at most fantasy writers, me included, like, we can write a part of a city. Like, we can go, oh, here's the market square. It's bustling. There's lots of commerce. We're doing things. And over here's the government, and it's very sad and restricted. But it's kind of like having the city as a character and being able to feel like everybody has their own common culture, but there's still different cultures clashing inside, is something that's really rooting. And if you can do that, you can do the China Miéville trick of having infinite stories told within that city, because to a certain extent, you don't care about the characters. You want to go back to see how the political fortunes of that city are doing. And none of that I can do at all. I can't do any of that. I set my my book in New York because I know New York well enough that I don't have to do a lot of research for it. But I wish I had the talent to be able to pull that level of detail in and make it seem like it was also good. And yes, I see Astro City is the bomb for that. Astro City is also a perfect example of doing that correctly.
Yeah.
So Tim, how about for you?
Well, for Necropolis, since it takes place in its own city that's divided into 5 quadrants, the whole thing's set up as a pentagram, and each quadrant is ruled by a different Dark Lord, and they're very different from each other. What was nice about that is I could do whatever I wanted, and I could let my imagination go crazy, which was a lot of fun. The hard part is that I would be writing a scene, and I would think, okay, they're going to like one particular building or shop or something, and I would be like, oh my God, what's on either side of this place? What's across the street? What's the street look like? What's everybody walking on the street look like? What are the sort of sights, sounds, and smells that would be there? That would be very different in a completely made-up world full of monsters than would be, on the streets of a city in Earth. So, it was a double-edged sword. It was a lot of fun to write, but at the same time, it's a big pain in the butt to try to come up with like names for just like businesses, and especially since I was trying to write a book that was lighter and had some humorous touches, they all had to be kind of either fun names or something weird and gross or whatever, and it just couldn't be like over here they sell cigarettes. It had to be something else. For the Shadow Watch series, what was nice about grounding part of it in Chicago was that it was like the kind of dichotomy that it's the heart of these characters. That there's the day world and there's the night world. There's the world we all inhabit while we wake, and then there's the dream world. And it's interesting to put them into a very kind of grounded, and nothing against Chicago, but it's to me it's a homier city than maybe New York. It's a much more doable city for me, but it also still has that kind of grit that I associate with cities. Never having grown up in the country, to me cities are a magical place, and so they show up a lot in my stories. But it was wonderful to be able to go back from that very tactile reality that people would recognize in Chicago to the dream world where the rules are can be very different. So I think that putting at least part of that book or that series in the real world helps a lot.
Mike, are you there?
I think we might have lost Mike.
No!
I kind of want to build on something Tim said, though, because the idea of like the character of cities. I am also a city girl. I grew up in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles gets a lot of flack for either not having a character or having a really lousy character. And I have to say, growing up in Los Angeles, you get a very different idea and a different perspective on Los Angeles than I think the rest of the world has about it. And I think that that's one of the exciting things you can do with cities, though, is you can kind of either draw on the popular consciousness of the character, So, for example, The Dragons of Heaven is set in San Francisco, in different parts of San Francisco. And so I draw on, and I now live in San Francisco, and so I draw on, in some cases, the kind of the allure of San Francisco, but then there's other ways where you can get into the kind of the personality that people don't know about the city, and it's already there, and you can kind of sort of start playing with that and playing those two things against each other. And I think Chicago, although I've never lived there, I think probably has something like that. I know Philadelphia definitely does, so I think that's I'm certain New York does.
Well, I think every city has its own secret vibe to it, which is the glory of growing up in town. I live in Cleveland, which is generally not thought of as a fine city. But, I mean, we have a tremendous amount of art. We have a tremendous amount of culture. We have literally the second best theater district in all the nation. We have literally the second best orchestra in the nation. We care a lot about culture. It's just we don't give a crap whether you know about it or not. And, I mean, but that's the thing. Cleveland's like this little scrappy city, which I love. And the joy of seeing a novel done properly that gets all those things right is it gets across not just across the character of the physical bulwarks, but the the actual character of the people who live there, because we all are in love with cities, and I think we all know that living in a city is its own special kind of survival skill.
Yes.
One of the things that strikes me about using cities too is that because they do have their own vibe, they're like real world equivalents of like Conan's Fantasy World or Oz or Middle Earth or Narnia, which in a lot of ways are kind of the same basic place. I mean, they still have magic and they have a lot of the same things, but the emphasis is different, the ingredients are put together different. And so I think that when like medieval fantasy settings became so ubiquitous and so interchangeable, I think in a lot of ways, maybe subconsciously, it's why people gravitated to cities, because they already came with, that kind of different vibe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So for like a contemporary fantasy project, what do you think about the difference between kind of start picking a city and then casting a plot and characters to fit it versus finding a city to fit an idea that you already have, and kind of what was the process or that order for each of you?
For me, it was always San Francisco. It was always Chinatown. It was always Big Trouble in Little China as one of my big kind of inspirational go-to references. It's just, the settlement of California, the relationship of after the gold rush and the Chinese in California, and like all of this stuff was totally the meat of where I wanted to go. And since Shanghai, which is the other city I actually spend a decent amount of time in, is very much a San Francisco style city, or San Francisco is a very Shanghai style city, since that one's much older, so technically I guess that gets the nod first. There's a lot of ways of playing off against them. So for me, it was the story grew up part and parcel with those places and was really set in it. I mean, we have a Dashiell Hammett Street.
Yeah, for me, I was writing Flux. It's interesting because I set it in New York because I lived in New York for several years, and I still love that town. And it's interesting how the characters I chose to have there were largely shaped by New York, and I hadn't really considered this until now. But you have Kit, who is an old Jewish guy, and the kind of old Jewish guy who takes no crap from anybody. And in fact, he's based on like all the old Jewish friends I had who would go down to the park and like basically try to shark each other at chess. And God forbid you thought you were good at chess and showed up there, and at which point they would let you let you win 2 games and then take you for everything you got on the third. You also have Valentine, who is basically a little too old. She's kind of grown out of the punk scene. Now she has to have an apartment. Now she actually has to worry about making a living, but she desperately does not want to give up any of this fun that she's having. So she lives in a crap hole of an apartment and makes every single sacrifice that every single person in New York does to try to get there. And so, I wouldn't say that, I started with New York City, but the minute I set the thing in New York City, I realized that there are certain characters who just don't survive in the town unless you can manage to make it there. So.
Well, for the Shadow Watch series, I chose Chicago, first of all, because it's the city I know best in terms of the bigger cities. I've just been there more times. And there's, I have kind of a nostalgia connection to it, because one of my favorite TV shows when I was a kid was Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was set in Chicago. And I'm like, awesome, I get to go ahead and have my characters run around the same city that Kolchak did. And the 2 characters, the leads, Audra and Jinx, I imagine them as being kind of the sort of characters that, are always kind of in trouble, at their job, and so always kind of second best. And Chicago has that, being the second city, and sometimes they have the reputation of having a bit of chip on their shoulder about we really are a great city, and it is. But the imagination of the world tends to be captured by New York, and I thought that would be fun. And so I had another pair of agents who were the top agents in the Shadow Watch, who were based in New York, and so they're an irritant to my heroes. So it seemed like that it was kind of half and half. I had the concept first. I was looking for a city. I knew Chicago well, and then once at that point I was able to kind of craft the narrative around elements of Chicago, instead of it just being set in Chicago just to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So a little both is my answer, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the questions that I'm kind of been thinking about myself, and I'd love to pose to you all so that I can benefit from your experience perspective, is kind of to what degree does and to what degree maybe should contemporary fantasy address very contemporary problems or kind of social issues? We look at kind of contemporary current events. We've got police violence, income inequality, gentrification, urban versus rural divide, and kind of how does a fantasy element make addressing those topics easier or harder, kind of as storytellers, and then as readers to kind of digest that?
The weird thing for me is my book came out like literally about a month ago at this point, and people are pointing out to me all of the ways in which it reflects modern society. To which I'm like, wow, I guess I'm smart because that went in there. I had no idea. And one of the fascinating things about throwing your book out into the world that I've discovered is finding out that people will take all of these sort of sub-thoughts that you had, these subconscious ideas that you woven into the book just because you believed in them, and turn them into something real. Like, for example, the best way that I can get it is I'm not opposed to drugs, but I don't particularly like them. I generally just get high on life, man. And a friend of mine said that in the book, it's kind of telling that when they actually make drugs, it consists of these very specific kinds of passions. You've got a bureaucracer and a woman who's a video game mancer teaming up, and the only way they can make drugs is literally by taking all of their personality out of it and turning it into something that only boring people can really use properly. And I'm like, wow, I didn't mean for that philosophy to be in there at all, but it totally is. So I think that basically, in the roundabout way to your question, Mike, you don't actually have to explicitly face it, but I think if you are legitimately investigating the characters and investigating what they're doing in a modern day era, you're going to kind of wind up reflecting the modern day struggles, whether you actually intended to or not. Mm-hmm. And just as a quick example, in the next book that I'm writing right now, which I just turned into you 2 days ago, it's out in October.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of showdowns with policemen, which reflect Ferguson, but I didn't realize any of that was happening right up until somebody pointed out to me in beta feedback on it. So, I mean, I don't know where you two explicitly put that kind of conflict in, but even if you're kind of organic like me and you don't, it's just going to come out anyway, I think. But what do you two folks do?
I'll let Tim go.
Oh, thanks. I'm still thinking about it. I think that maybe just by using the cities as a setting, that a lot of stuff will creep out that you don't think about, because you're thinking, in terms of like real world sort of analogs, that might be social issues, because you're thinking about, okay, my characters are going to have an encounter with the cops, or okay, they're going to have an encounter with somebody who sells drugs, or somebody selling themselves, or whatever, and or government, or this or that, and a lot of what we'll draw on then is just what's been around us for a while. One of the I can't remember the name of the website, but it reviews books from a social justice perspective, and the reviews of my books, when I read them on there, I'm like, wow, I didn't think that was there. I didn't, and I may not agree with the perspective of the person who is reviewing a book and saying, well, this book loses points for this because it was insensitive or something. But it's great to see how somebody would take that, and then sometimes I'll use things like that for
things for the fantasy, as in vampire fan.
Yep, I think.
Website.
Yeah, for example, in the first Necropolis book, because I have people who the monsters all moved to another dimension, they didn't think anything was living there when they moved, and it turns out there was, and it was a different reviewer, but the reviewer said it was kind of typical colonialism, and that we see throughout Earth's history, and I was like, wow, it never occurred to me, and so I actually used that as a big plot point in the third book. So sometimes, it does come across as something you plan, but other times it's something that if somebody else sees it there, you can pick up that thread and run with it.
For me, so it's funny because one thing you said was, how much should it? And I guess I like the one thing I'm always like, I don't know that I would say for other people, like, should for their writing, but I know for me it's definitely, I very much feel that we create the world that we live in through the stories we tell. So for me it is actually really important to kind of think about these issues and be conscious of them and to deploy them consciously. And so for me, writing a lot of Chinese characters, writing about drawing on Chinese narratives, the Three Kingdoms and all of that kind of stuff, the Water Margin, and a lot of those foundational narratives, I really wanted to be as conscious as possible about, appropriation. I wanted to be conscious about representation. I did a lot of research on issues in representation. And so all of those things were important to me. And then also I'm dealing with, I said my background's in folklore, but it's also in anthropology, and it's particularly in kind of globalization and economics and anthropology. And so I actually talk a lot about the kind of the global community and these kinds of, we're not in these little pods anymore. We've got all this economic infrastructure and all these relationships and, political relationships going way back and all these things. And so, kind of dealing with a post-colonial, assuming we can make that claims about society, how do we kind of work out these complex relationships? And so all those things very much informed the story I was writing and what I was trying to tell. But I also know there's going to be a bunch of stuff in there that I wasn't thinking about, that I wasn't being considered about, and that readers will draw upon or connections that they'll make. And I think that that's one of the kind of cool things about the conversation between the author and the reader is as much stuff as I put in there that are about my particular perspective or the research I've done or anything like that, the reader's going to be drawing out other things that were not deliberately intended, but that were unconsciously intended. And so I think that's pretty cool. I think
I included the should mostly to be provocative, and then to be able to have everybody react against that. So do a little bit of a leading question. Yeah, I definitely appreciate any writer kind of trying to build in that thoughtfulness about kind of the social implications, because I'm very much on their kind of if you don't make a particular statement about a thing, you're just reaffirming the status quo. And that dialogue between the reader and the writer is a very fun thing to pay attention to. So we're coming up toward the top of the hour, and unless I get some questions coming in, so anyone who's watching, you can tweet questions using hashtag #ARLive, and we'll be able to fit those in. If you can't get to them right away, or if you're watching on YouTube after the original broadcast, then you can leave questions kind of on the YouTube page or at the Angry Robot website, and we may be able to get to them. But for now, what I'd love to do is go back around the table and invite each of our panelists to suggest some other contemporary fantasy, either recent or older, that they've really enjoyed, so that anyone who's watching can build out a broader reading list after they read, of course, all the fabulous contemporary fantasies from our authors who are panelists. Plug, plug. All right, anyone can jump in first on this one.
The problem is I'm the worst at it because I have to think about what qualifies according to the genre.
Well, yes, any fantasy that's modern. I'll throw one out. I'm really fond of J. Wells' Prospero's War, which it's like The Wire but with magic. So it's almost a neighbor to Flux, because there's a strong crime element that kind of resonates there. And that one is set in a fictional city that's modeled after several Rust Belt cities, and it replaces the war on drugs with the war on magic. So it does to kind of a procedural cop with a magical framework, and that's 3 books in now. The first one is called Dirty Magic, and that one I've really enjoyed that. series, others to come up with some ideas.
Hmm?
I guess I'm going to go really old school, and it's because all my books are messed up because I just unpacked my bookshelves. I moved like last week. But one of the fun things is as you're unpacking your books, you're like, oh God, I remember this one. I remember this one. And I was particularly looking at like the urban fantasy, my foundational urban fantasy, and one of the ones that, three of the ones, to talk about three, that were foundational for me. And I think they're also foundational for the genre in a lot of ways, were the Border Town stuff I don't even remember. The Border Town stuff is like still just gritty and gross and awesome and just rock and roll in a kind of sort of late 80s way, but they're just a lot of fun. And that's a fairy, gritty urban crossover kind of stuff. Emma Bull's War for the Oaks, which is again just a foundational text for me, and I think it's gorgeous and awesome. And I'm going to indulge in my 12-year-old girl id, the Mercedes Lackey Elves and Motorcycles stuff, which I love so much I can't even. So yeah, I don't know that those would hold up, but I am very fond of them. So yeah.
It's funny. I like those elves and race car books too. So
I loved them. Thank you. Okay, I feel better.
Yeah, and War for the Oaks, I'd list that, and Charles DeLynn stuff. We mentioned it earlier, and I would mention that. Paul Anderson had a series of stories, and I think a novel that was set in an alternate Earth. I mean, it was our Earth, but it evolved with magic, and a lot of his stories took place in World War II, and you could see how World War II was different because of magic, and I thought those were really interesting. Thinking probably early college, I read Piers Anthony's Incarnations of Immortality series, and it takes place in a world that would be like a contemporary fantasy world, except he never spends any time there. The godlike characters are off in their own dimensions doing stuff. And I remember reading those parts, little bits, and thinking, I really want to know more about this world. And so for me, it started me thinking about the idea of urban fantasy. And then even though it wasn't urban or contemporary fantasy, the Thieves' World anthologies, I mean, they were set in a city, they had characters, they would interact, and through the volumes you'd find out what was going on with the city, and it has the feeling of what today is urban fantasy in a lot of ways. So I'd list all those.
Okay. And for me, I'd actually go with two people I've already mentioned, but that's okay. I'm brain dead. I go over things like that. Max Gladstone's series is not technically urban fantasy per se because it takes place in an alternate city, but the alternate city is really, really good. Basically, it takes place in a city where, basically they've taken gods who have fallen and they use them as the heating supply for the entire town. And if that's not enough of a pitch for you, because that would totally bring me into a book, basically it winds up where the god who is heating the town actually dies, and they have to bring in a bunch of magical lawyers to try to fight over the legal battles that are going to erupt as a result of that. And they are phenomenal books. They're really, really fun to read, and he's just getting better with every book, so I can wholeheartedly recommend him. One of the others I would recommend, which is kind of urban fantasy, but a little weird, Robert Bennett's American Elsewhere, which was a book that was so good, it was the first book I read after major surgery, and it made me remember that I could read again, which was awesome. And basically, if you want to take it, it takes like a 1950s town where there are basically Cthulhuoid monsters who are trying to learn to live as humans, except they're not doing it that well. And that's not the central pitch, that's not the central story thread of the book, but it's one of the few books where you see the Lovecraftian monsters who find us as equally alien and unsettling as it does, and we're driving them mad as they're driving us mad. And then I think I would be very remiss if I didn't bring up, and I'm blanking on the name of the series right now, Shauna McGuire's set of urban fantasies, which are also really, really good and incredibly good reads, even though I both hate, loathe, and worship Shauna for somehow managing to put out 15 books a month.
Yeah, those are the Toby Day series.
The Toby Day series, thank you.
And then she also has the Encrypted series, which I'm very fond of.
Mm-hmm. I have not read that yet, but I'm sure by the time I get around to it, she'll have written 5 more books.
Yeah.
So.
We do have a couple of questions that have come up through the Q&A thing, so I'm going to select them, which hopefully means that they show up for you all, but I'm also going to read them for everyone. This is from Avery. Have you had any fantastic experiences yourselves, and have they informed your approach to contemporary fantasy? So, like fantastic, numinous, or kind of wondrous experiences.
Are we blanking on this question, or is my mic going off?
No, we can hear you, so you can answer first.
Yeah.
The answer is
Damn it! I lost the game. No, I have not had any fantastic experiences myself with regards to fantasy. I have had a lot of experience with drugs, which basically went into Flux, mostly as a bystander. You know, a lot of one of the proudest moments for me in having Flux reviewed was by one of my friends who has done every drug under the planet and routinely talks about that. It's like, oh, you got drug culture right. I'm like, if you say I got it right, Bart, I got it right. So, but no, not a whole lot of numinous approaches such as that. So.
Well, I've had some, but every single one of them, probably anything we experience, can be chalked up to just human perception and imagination. But I've had some at the time, seemed like they were real. Like dreams that little snatches of dreams that come true, or just strange kind of coincidental occurrences. And even if it is just my imagination, it still gives you the feeling for what it's like. If you were actually in a situation where something strange or out of the ordinary, reality bending a little bit actually happens. So yeah, and even just weird misperceptions. Like in the space of a week once, I saw two different men walking backwards. One was walking up a hill and the other was walking around a parking lot backwards and behind the businesses. And I don't know if it was some strange exercise fad, or I have no clue what it was, but you get this sense of unreality when you see something like that. And so it gives you what it feels like to see something strange like that, and then of course you can use it as the basis for stories. So, but did I actually ever go through the little wardrobe to Narnia? Not that I'm allowed to tell anybody. So.
I have a remarkably kind of I guess it feels like a very regular, banal sort of life, but I'm very strange experience adjacent. For example, I have a friend who found a dead body on a Greyhound bus, and that same friend witnessed police pulling over a car and clowns getting out and then getting into a street fight. And there were witnesses, so this really happened. And so I am envious of this friend who is able to have these experiences that are just strange and bizarre and make him into a Chuck Palahniuk character. I don't tend to have those, but I do kind of like what Tim was saying. I try to cultivate like a magical thinking in relation to my everyday things, so that if I see something weird, I try to extrapolate. I don't try to normalize it. I try to extrapolate. I try to be like, what's the weird story there? So as much as I can, I try to create that kind of perception in myself so that I can better access that for the telling of stories. And I've also had some experiences in altered states of consciousness.
Yep, and we can leave that there since this is public in the internets. So the other question we had from Avery was kind of on subgenre. And so urban fantasy / contemporary fantasy has long been dominated by paranormal romance. Do you feel the market is starting to explore other avenues of urban fantasy, or is paranormal romance still informing the editorial choices of major publishers? And I would say kind of frame this in your own experience kind of as a reader or a writer, and then I can talk a little bit as a publisher if folks are so inclined. Just so this can be broadened to kind of what other subgenres or genres do you see contemporary fantasy kind of combining with? Maybe is another way to frame this.
Well, it's interesting for me because you're always going to have publishers gravitating towards that sort of thing because it's easy to sell. One of the things that you can get caught up in talking about the genre thing is that basically I think everybody here just writes books, and then we write them and we try to figure out what sort of marketing hat to put on afterwards when we have this thing on the table. So I think what you're dealing with here in a case is this kind of schism between the creator who's created this very personal thing which comes direct from their soul, and as we've already established, there are themes we are unaware of which just sort of pop up when other people start interacting with it. But you also deal with the fact that it's a lot easier for a publisher to take something that happens to fit in a box which other people like and say, this is a lot like this thing. For example, when Mike, when you're selling Flex, you came up with the tagline of it's Breaking Bad meets Jim Butcher. And I'm not necessarily sure that's an accurate thing. It's probably close enough to get us there. But the point is that if you can compare it to something that they already like, it's a lot easier to get somebody to buy it than it is to give somebody something that they just blows their mind and you can't compare it to anything. So the short answer to this is I think you're always going to have paranormal romance being a strong thing because romance has always been a strong thing. Hook it up with a little bit of fantasy or science fiction or whatever, that's always going to be a strong thing that you can sell to romance readers. It doesn't mean that publishers aren't looking for other stuff. It just means it's going to be a lot easier to sell if it happens to be down a well-trod avenue as opposed to wandering off somewhere down the path. So.
I've seen maybe a few more historical fantasies. I mean, they're set in the real world, in real history. Things like Naomi Novak's books, and C.C. Finley had some that were set during the American Revolution. Mike Resnick had one that was American Revolution, but it was like alternate history that there were still dinosaurs in America when people got here, and so they actually had dinosaurs they could fight with in the Revolutionary War. Yeah. So I'm seeing some of that. The romantic element still seems to be in there. It seems like that contemporary fantasy, urban fantasy, still tries to keep a lot of times the romantic element on some level, maybe not as a huge emphasis, but a lot of books I think could be packaged either way. They could show up on different either shelf in the bookstore, just depending on, just give them a slight nudge one way or the other. So I think that you see the maybe trying to appeal, to both types of readers, ones who might normally just seek out paranormal romance, or ones that might just normally seek out urban fantasy. Some of the things that strike me as very like Patricia Briggs' books. Some of them strike me as closer to paranormal romance, except they're marketed as urban fantasy. And I love them, but so I think there's a little bit more of these days, probably more of like a bleed over between the genres, or just sort of a friendly handshake between the genres, I guess.
It's funny because I almost want to hear Mike's answer more, because I think you just probably have a lot more insight into this than we do, kind of as writers and readers. I know when I was looking for comps, comparative books, when I was trying to send the Dragons of Heaven out to agents and things like that, I had a really hard time because I couldn't find a lot of things that were pulp adventure wuxia in printed form. I mean, you've got wuxia, and wuxia has a lot of romance elements and fantasy elements and all of that. And you've got pulp adventure, which has, a lot of sometimes romance elements, but, that kind of a thing. So it was really kind of, hard to find anybody, a lot of things that were in my niche in printed form. When you get movies and other media, manga, stuff like that, you start opening out a lot wider. Which doesn't really answer your paranormal fantasy, paranormal romance / urban fantasy divide, but I think Tim really kind of nailed it on the head, which is that there's a lot of that is just nudging one way or the other. I have heard people talk about how they were kind of, prompted to beef up the romance a little bit more, we'll market it as that, or beef up the fantasy a little bit more, we'll market it as that. I have, Marie Brennan has a urban fantasy series out where she, it's in college, and I love the idea of urban fantasy in college, but for some reason everybody wants to have everybody in high school. And she ended up self-publishing it. She could have sold it to a large publisher, but only if she moved it down to YA, down to high school. And I'm really glad she didn't, because I think it works in college. But so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of like nudging towards, if this could be on the cusp, then pushing it towards what's popular or not. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'd say from my perspective that the thing with paranormal romance, and Tim has kind of ID'd this pretty effectively, is there's a marketing conflation between those subgenres where I think I think the Venn diagram of urban fantasy versus paranormal romance is that the union of those two is seen as larger than it may actually be. It, like, speaking from a really kind of let's build check box list, just because there, and I think there's a danger where we have paranormal romance books shelved in romance in some, in like major bookstores, and then you have urban fantasy books with notable romance elements, but they're not in the same section in that bookstore. In a lot of stores, fantasy and science and next to each other with kind of a granted lead-over section, and that's something that is really an advantage in terms of digital shelf and thinking about shelves digitally, because you can have there's something called BISAC codes, which are classification codes that say this book is this genre, and you can have BISACs that say contemporary fantasy, fantasy romance, and family saga. So if a book is both an urban fantasy and has a strong romance element and there's a multi-generational family aspect, it can exist on all three of those bookshelves simultaneously from a digital categorization standpoint. So that obviates a lot of the problems of an either-or approach, which kind of a limited physical bookshelf approach requires. Now you're going to have some bookstores where they and I do think the hand that retails a book has strictures that otherwise creators necessary. That dialogue between market demand and kind of the aesthetic agendas of artists, where you want to sell your work, and you find, as both Ferrett and Alyc have said, you can nudge your work a little bit in one direction or another, and maybe have a better chance of finding an audience. I do think that other genres are finding some cool crossover. I definitely see a lot of crime and contemporary fantasy crossover. On the Angry Robot list, we have the Collector series by Chris Holm is definitely both crime and contemporary fantasy, and there's a lot of that out there. And what I find is that the crime audience is really welcoming to other genres where a book is also crime. So romantic suspense is crime and read by crime readers as well as romance readers. Urban fantasy with a crime element is read as crime. Dana Cameron, under 47 North, has a series that's very well embraced by the crime community because she came from that community. But it's also straight up urban fantasy with werewolves. So there's a lot in there that kind of goes back and forth, would be my perspective. And then we have a question from Dave Robison, friend of the show. One of the functions of fantasy genre is to allow us to work through cultural issues in a safe framework, safe quote-unquote. Do you think fantasy set in a contemporary setting, or by making it so close to the real world, makes it too close? So this comes a little bit back around to one of the topics that we addressed earlier. Kind of how do you think that non-mimetic fantasy element plays into addressing these issues? Is this a distancing mechanism? Is it about metaphor? Like, how do you see that being applied?
It's interesting to me because what I wound up doing in Flux is flipping a lot of the stuff that comes around. And the best example I can give is that the central storyline of Flux is that you have Paul, who is a father. He loves his daughter very much. His daughter gets burned horribly in a fire, and he eventually has to make magical drugs in order to save her. But the interesting thing about this is because in Flux everything stems from obsession, and he has become very obsessed with paperwork and with magic and with investigating all of this, that in many ways he has become a rather crappy father over the past couple of years. And so when his daughter gets burned and he comes close to losing her, he realizes, oh my God, I've almost lost that, and that becomes much more of a thing. But unfortunately, everything that he has to do to save his daughter brings him deeper into this world of magic and drug making and all this stuff, which makes him not a good parent. And it wasn't until later on when I was talking to my wife about it that I realized that in a very fantastic way, I had flipped the usual female question on its head, which is I took a male character and I said, well, really, Paul, can you have a career and a daughter and have it all? And I didn't think about that, but in fact, that is, again, what I was investigating. And it probably doesn't occur to most readers until they get through it, or if it occurs to them at all. But again, using fantasy is a good way of coming sideways at that, in the same way that Joe Haldeman's Forever War was an absolutely perfect way of picking the Vietnam War apart without necessarily tripping over the landmines of getting wrapped around that particular set of real-world facts.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. Other thoughts on that from Tim or Alyc?
Yeah, I think kind of building on what Ferrett says, I think because a lot of it, as much as, you know, we have these kinds of big epic fantasy getting into these big metaphors, or secondary world fantasy or whatever, non-mimetic fantasy getting into these big metaphors, I think that a lot of where the kind of interesting work fantasy, interesting metaphorical work fantasy does, is in the personal relationships. And so, like, you know, Ferrett was saying about the father-daughter relationship and the kind of challenges that the father was coming to. You know, that's a real challenge that people meet every day. It just, in this case, it was magical drugs that was the impetus for it. I have you know, Missy has a similar familial conflict that's around kind of responsibility to family, and I don't want to say too much because it'll give some stuff away. But you know, she has some kind of complex relationships that she needs to kind of work out and figure out her responsibilities toward other people versus her responsibility toward herself, and thinking about self-care in terms of the way that one particular relationship gets a little difficult. And you know, it happens that it's taking place in a fantasy environment, but it's a very real issue that a lot of women face about how do I deal with a problematic relationship where I've got family ties and other things keeping me in a place that's maybe not the best for me. And you know, I think that you can tell those kinds of stories in a secondary world, in an urban fantasy world, in space. It's the real stories that about the personal relationships that I think are the most interesting for me.
I think that fantasy, it's distancing in the sense that people may not realize that what they're reading about, you know, it could be told, you know, the relationship parts, the parts about the society. I mean, it could be told in just contemporary, you know, mainstream fiction. I think that fantasy allows people to think, oh, this is cool, and they don't realize that, you know, they're getting this other stuff too, maybe. Or it just makes it more fun to read with the other stuff. It's like, you know, having like a different kind of icing on the cake. You know, the cake stays the same, but, you know, the icing can make it taste different enough for people. And I also think that fantasy can wake them up, because like the TV series from years ago, Alien Nation, you know, which is about, you know, the immigrant experience and prejudice, and you could have done that very realistically, but instead, you know, we have these aliens that suddenly kind of, you know, sought refuge on Earth and are trying to find their ways into Earth society, and it wakes you up. You pay more attention to it in a lot of ways. So I think that fantasy, science fiction, and horror, and any blend of them can really work well to get at stuff that, in a lot of ways, I think people might overlook. So it works great for that.
And one of the things that I like about that in particular is I went to Clarion, which was a 6-week writing workshop intensive. And what I thought would be great about Clarion would be getting my stories critiqued. As it was, what was the really great thing was critiquing 17 stories a week. Because the thing is, when I made the mistakes, it was too painful to see. But when I saw 17 other people making very similar mistakes, then I could shuck my ego away from that, shuck all of my investments in being correct, and just start to basically import that into my story after seeing somebody screw up in a very similar way. And I think, in a way, fantasy or science fiction or horror can be good at slipping through the back door, because you're not talking about Ferguson with all of the attenuated feel-goods or feel-bads about race and your loyalty towards policemen and so forth. It's about this other werewolf versus vampire environment, and then you can sort of start to see how the other person does, and then when you realize where the metaphor is going, suddenly you wake up and maybe you have a new set of opinions by the time you're done with it. So.
Cool. Well, that is the last question that I have. I don't have anything else on Twitter. So at this point, I think what I'd like to do is ask you each to kind of rattle off some social media links. So if you're on Twitter or Facebook, and then your website, and then folks can go and look up your work, and you can find each and every one of these fine authors' Angry Robot books at angryrobotbooks.com. Because this is really ultimately nothing more than a crass marketing ploy. No, it's about having fun and talking about things.
Buy my book.
Also a crass marketing ploy. Yeah. All right, so let's start with Tim.
Well, I'm on Facebook just as Tim Waggoner. My last name's Waggoner. On Twitter at Tim Waggoner and www.timwaggoner.com. So I think that's all of them.
Cool. And Ferrett?
My name is spelled weird. It's 2 R's and 2 T's. So on Twitter, I am Ferrett himself. That's Ferret himself. Kind of like Neil Gaiman because I have no imagination whatsoever. And my website is www.theferrett.com. That's theferret.com.
And Alyc.
And I'm Alyc Helms everywhere. You can even Google me by my first name. So that's A-L-Y, although you might get the Latin American Yachting Association. So that's ALYCHELMS. That's alychelms.com. That's at Alyc Helms on Twitter. That's Alyc Helms on Facebook. And my goal is to get people to learn how to pronounce my name correctly.
Cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us in this fun conversation. And this will be on YouTube. And then if you're finding this on YouTube, be sure to hop over to angryrobotbooks.com to find out about all of these wonderful books by these fabulous people. And there are several other videos. And in the far, far future, there will be many hundreds of Angry Robot live videos, perhaps. I've been Mike Underwood with Angry Robot Books. And in the meantime, until I see you next, stay angry.